Here's where we've been. I can't believe these go so fast. Maybe they seem like they go forever for you, but they go pretty quickly for me. We talked about rites of passage and the sense of ritual and the meaning of ritual and perhaps the lack of ritual in our contemporary societies. We talked about a specific ritual called the medicine wheel from the plains, northern plains, Cree in particular, that was not just about time, but about space and orientation in space. Then we went to the surly and sarcastic Soren Kierkegaard, who is one of my favorite philosophers, apparently not one of yours, but that's okay. And then Sigmund Freud, of course, Carl Jung. That was really fun and interesting. Last week was Lawrence Kohlberg, and this week is Erikson. What we're doing here is seeing how we develop, how we become who we are. We're looking at stages along life's way. And I really like this series. It's a little different than what we're used to because it's mostly based in psychology. But still, I think it's, you'll see, if you haven't already, that psychologists are using myth and philosophy and everything else. Speaking of which, Erikson. Really an interesting guy, as I've told some of you already. 1902 to 1994, born near Frankfurt, Germany, and born of a secret romance of his Jewish mother and an unknown Dane, right? So his mother married when he was 3 years old, but Erikson took after his unknown Danish father in appearance. So he had this Nordic appearance about him, but he was Jewish. So if you have ever been, or if you know of people who have kind of exist in between the easy categories we give to people, you know that's an interesting and liminal stage for people. I think of Native people especially who live this life, but anyone who doesn't fit easily into a category it can be especially creative and especially difficult in finding their way. So this is a really interesting fact of Erikson that, and his theory, how it develops. I always say I don't want to psychoanalyze these people too much, but then they are asking for it because they're psychologists. So his real name was Hamburger, Erik Hamburger, and he changed it to Erik Hamburger Erikson in 1939. Not a bad move in 1939, if you're in Germany, to change that name, right? And he gave this name to himself, and of course, he didn't know his father, so he is Erik and Erik's son. So there's something going on there with this name, and well, you'll just see. He was a wanderer, an artist, self-educated. He traveled all around Europe, largely self-trained in everything, in art, in psychology. He lived as a bohemian during the early 20th century. Rebellious, confused, in between, right? He was in this liminal stage. He kind of found himself when he began teaching art, because he was an artist and his theory is based in art in large degree, to the children of Americans who came to Vienna to study psychoanalysis with Freud and his circle. So I love this. So, you know, there's Freud, his circle, the Vienna Circle, and Americans flocking to Europe to be psychoanalyzed by Freud, and this guy teaches art to their children, right? So he's like right there on the edge. I love it. He becomes a Montessori instructor, and then he begins studying psychoanalysis with Anna Freud, Freud's daughter. So they she practices psychoanalysis on him. He learns it that way. And then, of course, teaches himself psychoanalysis and becomes part of the community there, from teaching their children art to becoming one of the leading lights of the new psychoanalysis. Certified without a medical degree in child psychiatry. He did all this without any credentials, and I love that because our founder was like that, Manly Hall. I don't know that Manly had even a high school diploma, but he did everything and wrote everything and taught everything and remembered everything. I like those stories where you don't have to go through the system to achieve wisdom. And this is Erikson. He ended up teaching Harvard, Yale, Berkeley. Did I mention that? Oh, I'll mention it in a minute. He also, not surprisingly, for a man this innovative and interesting, had an interesting wife. Her name was Sarah Lucretia Surson, until she changed it to Sarah Mowat Surson, then to Sally Mowat Surson, then to Joan Mowat Surson, and then married Erikson, whose name is made up too, right? And became Joan Mowat Hamburger, his original Jewish name, then Joan Mowat Erikson. And they were naturalized as U.S. citizens using this made-up name of Erikson. So you wouldn't be surprised that a guy like this would develop a theory based on identity crises, right? And that's exactly what he did. But she was interesting in her own right. She was his editor, his research collaborator. She wrote these books, The Universal Bead, Activity, Recovery, and Growth, Wisdom and the Senses. She was an art therapist. She was very interested in dance and teaching dance and performing dance as therapeutic activities, and especially interested in play. Help me remember, sometime we should talk about Johann Huizinga's book, Homo Ludens, the playing animal. Really interesting insights into who we are in terms of play. Well, she was onto that early on. She believed that the arts possess their own healing properties and could be used as an exclusive form of therapy. Now, remember, we kind of take that for granted now, but this was a radically new thing, a problematic thing in the beginning when she was advocating for it. She worked with patients at the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts, developmentally disabled people, and practiced art therapy and play therapy. All right, so I love this couple. They're so interesting. So Erik Erikson taught at several prominent universities. Again, no training. I love this. Yale, Berkeley, the Menninger Foundation, Mount Zion Hospital. He's a doctor in San Francisco and also at Harvard. But he kept moving on because he didn't like the political views of his employers. So he left Yale because of the anti-Semitic attitudes he encountered there. He left Yale for Berkeley, and then he left Berkeley for Boston because at Berkeley he was asked to sign a loyalty oath. This was during the 50s, during the McCarthy era. And he wasn't a communist, but he objected to the very notion of signing loyalty oaths, so he left. There's a great image there, propaganda poster, right? He was, and this, I think you'll find this in these foundational thinkers, is that they're invariably interdisciplinary, right? So he was not just a psychologist or a psychiatrist, he was a cultural anthropologist. He worked with veterans in initial work on what we now call PTSD. He lived among the Lakota Sioux in South Dakota and wrote about parenting among the Lakota. He lived with the Yurok tribe here in California. In fact, his theory of the identity crisis came largely from his work on veterans with PTSD. He wrote about the dangers of nuclear war. He wrote about race and ethnicity, and worked and talked often with Huey Newton, the Black Panther leader. He worked on juvenile delinquency. If you're interdisciplinary, you get to play in all these areas, and knowledge becomes more interconnected that way. So very interesting stuff, very interesting person who wandered around the world and wandered through academic disciplines to develop his outlook. His most famous book is Childhood and Society, 1950, reprinted in 1985. But he also wrote Identity, Youth in Crisis, The Life Cycle Completed, Young Man Luther, and then Gandhi's Truth. So you can see just in his bibliography there that he's wide-ranging in thought. But it's Childhood and Society that's especially relevant for us tonight and for his theory of stages along life's way. All right, so here it is. And you know, if you're like me, you kind of recoil at being put in boxes. And so anytime I see a chart like this, I'm looking for ways to mess with the boxes, right? But at the same time, what they're aiming for, what all these psychologists and theorists are aiming for is really understanding. And we do go through stages, right? We are different at different ages. And we do develop similarly, I think, as human beings. It doesn't have to be exactly, but I think similarly. So I think their aspiration is good. So here's what he saw. As you can see, there's 8 stages, and they go from these ages here. First 4 stages are from the infant to age 11, and the last 4 from adolescence to late adulthood. We're also going to see about a stage 9. That always interests me, is when you add on another stage. So each of these stages, Erikson said, presents its own unique challenges that he called crises, identity crises. So they're not just crises that you have to get through. They're identity crises. They go right to your core. And these are crises of the ego. Now, you may remember that Freud is not an ego psychologist. He is an id psychologist. He believes that what really determines how we develop as human beings is what happens in the id and how we deal with that. How we manage the id when it comes out with the return of the repressed. How we manage it when it appears in dreams or in slips of the tongue or the pen. He bases human development in terms of the id. Jung, and especially Erikson, are ego psychologists. Kohlberg is too. They're basing human development on how the ego manages both the id, both the unconscious, and the social order. Freud's actually not that interested in the social order because everything he thinks is happening in the id. But with these sons of Freud, we might say, you could do a lot with that phrase, couldn't you? Sons of Freud. They want to expand him. They want to expand Freud's insights, and they should, because Freud saw that human development was basically psychosexual and not positive, actually. It was basically dealing with neuroses, and there was no fulfillment, really. There was just the release of tension. So Erikson's one of these followers of Freud, sons of Freud, who shifts the focus to the ego and then looks to expand it, the notion of human development to the ego, but also to psychosocial factors. So for each of these stages, you have an identity crisis and it's an ego crisis. So remember, this is Freudian, and Erikson is using Freud's stages, as you'll see in a minute. But it is a question for the ego to handle. And if you remember that it is operating according to the pleasure principle, it is simply pleasure or the avoidance of pain. The superego is society's mores and ethics and laws, customs that get embedded into the psyche from outside, typically through the parents, but also through education. And the ego kind of has to balance all these, right? It's the center, and it's the center for Jung in a different way. It's the center for Erikson in a very particular way, and that is it's the feature of the psyche that resolves the crisis, all right? So the ego is very important here. And a word before we get into the actual stages. This is operating according to the epigenetic principle, which means that these things are going to happen unless these stages are going to emerge unless something prevents them from emerging. We saw this a little bit with Jung, is that the development pattern is kind of there already. And what prevents it from happening is you have to be kind of deliberate. Either your parents have to deliberately mess you up, or you don't resolve something yourself. But left to its own devices, the human psyche, according to Erikson and Jung, will develop along these lines. Now, we'll talk about how to retard the development. There are ways to do that, but fortunately, there are ways to address that retardation. So the epigenetic principle means that each stage forms out of the other and forms according to a pattern that is kind of given. Erikson might say not kind of. He would say given. It's going to happen. So that's a biological sense that, once you have an egg, if you leave it alone and don't harm it, a chicken was going to come from it. Of course, that's a metaphor, so that breaks down a little bit. So what happens here, and you'll see this, I hope you can see it, we're going to get into it, is there are two responses to the crisis at every stage. So look at just look at stage 1. 0 to 2 years old, the infant must trust or mistrust. If trust, then the infant will develop into the next stage without any psychological harm. With mistrust, then the infant will go into the next stage, but with an unresolved crisis that must be addressed at some later stage. Right? This is where the biological metaphor breaks down. You can actually go back and fix things in Erikson's notion. So there's a basic strength that arises from this identity crisis at each stage, and there's a basic pathology, mistrust, for example, that arises from each stage. All right, let's get into it then. I know, right? Cool kid. Stage 1, trust versus mistrust, the infancy stage, 0 to 2 years. Remember, he's following Freud, so the psychosexual mode here is going to be oral, respiratory, sensory, or kinesthetic. Kinesthetic just means in motion. So here's another thing that Erikson does with Freud's theory that I think is really interesting and helpful, is he expands the psychosexual stages to include more than something like the Oedipus complex, right? He broadens it to include respiratory. So it's not just the oral stage in Freud, remember, where the infant is obsessed with putting things in her mouth or nipples or stuff like that. Erikson says, no, it's not just about that. It's about respiratory, learning to breathe and being free to breathe, taking in all kinds of sense data, not just the oral sense data. Moving around, moving the limbs around, kinesthetic. So that's really interesting and fairly radical to do to Freud there, is to expand it like that. Freud would hate that because Freud was more of a scientist, more reductionistic. As you'll see, Erikson's more of an artist, more of a connector. He wants to have an interdisciplinary approach here. So the crucial element here, not surprisingly, is the mother or the mother figure. The child learns trust and mistrust at this stage from the mother. And it's got to be in the right proportion, like everything else in life. So a healthy sense of mistrust is necessary. You shouldn't trust anybody outright all the time. So if the infant's basic needs are neglected, that's a problem and creates mistrust. If the infant is overindulged at this stage, that's a problem and creates not mistrust, but imbalance in the infant's expectations. So the child's needs are not just oral, not just sexual. It's about experiencing pleasure from the breast or the bottle. It's about physical contact. It's about physical contact as a symbol for attention or an indicator of attention, of care. And that produces, Erikson says, trust. So the ego's already in development here for Erikson, because you can tell there's a reality principle at work, right? So the id operates according to the pleasure principle, but the ego according to the reality principle, meaning, okay, what's really happening here? And it's not an ontological or epistemological question, of course. It's simply what works. So is this woman going to feed me or not? Or am I going to lie in my bed a long time crying? If she feeds me, okay, I've made a connection here. There's a reality connection here. If I cry and she comes and my hunger is slated, then okay, good, that works. They're little scientists, actually. You know, they're testing hypotheses at this stage, says Erikson. So this is where we get this notion of mother-child bonding. I mean, it's where we get one notion of it. Of course, it's kind of obvious. Here's what Erikson said, too, that I think is very interesting. He says the child must not only learn to trust its mother, but to trust itself. At infancy, the child must learn to trust itself. So, for example, when teething happens and this strange new pain occurs that you've never understood before, if the infant's bonded with the mother or the mother figure at this point, then the infant can trust the mother to figure this out, right? And that means ultimately, Erikson says, that the child is trusting her reality principle. Pretty interesting, I think. So the mother's a very important, obviously, figure, but in different ways than we've ever seen in terms of this stages along life's way. So the strength that develops in the first stage, stage one, is hope. So, you know, if I can figure this out as an infant with no words, you know, and just these basic oral, respiratory, sensory, kinesthetic interfaces with the world, then, okay, then there's hope, right? If I can't figure this out, if I can't trust the person in charge of me, then I'm not going to trust the world, and so I'm going to withdraw. So Erikson traces withdrawal, the sense of the default position of withdrawing from the world, back to the infancy stage because of this lack of trust based on, again, the reality principle. I think that's fascinating. I'm not sure it's right, but it's fascinating, and it might be. Stage 2, 2 to 3 years, psychosexual mode is anal. Again, following Freud's stages here, but also urethral and muscular. So, the toddler is now at this stage, 2 to 3 years, is trying to gain a sense of autonomy and control of her own body, right? So now she's partly ambulatory, or starting to be. walking, talking, later dressing, feeding oneself, toilet training, etc. There's a lot of stress at this point, a lot of new things happening to the child. And so, again, if there's all these stages grow out of each other. So if there's mistrust in that first stage, then that's exacerbated in the second stage, when all these bodily changes are happening and you can't trust the person who's in the room with you, mother. So there's also, and this again is what I love about Erikson, is that the child has agency here. We tend to think when we look at child development, especially as the child is kind of a blank slate, and the mother especially, but also the father, and sometimes society imprints these things on the child. But for Erikson, the child has agency all along, even in the infancy stage. So the child, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but the child learning to walk will need help, but eventually will resent the help, right? And say, I can do it. Leave me alone. I can do it, Mommy. And there's this interesting tension there that Erikson noticed. So then the crisis is back to the mother, to the parents. How much do they help? How little do they help? And there are no answers here, because we're dealing with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. And if you've ever dealt with a 2 or 3-year-old, you know there are no answers. There are no answers, because whatever you do is going to produce a reaction, because the child, again, has agency and is trying to do things for herself. So yeah, it's a really interesting time here, the second stage. Erikson believed, as maybe some of you do and have read, that anxious mothers in particular here transfer that to the child, especially at this stage. I don't know, that's what he thought. So you can't be anxious, and at the same time you can't be a saint, because your child will not allow you to be a saint when she is 2, because she's testing boundaries and borders here. So they need standards, and the children need standards, and they need to be able to violate those standards. And so good luck having children. Now, it's interesting, because this is what I love about Erikson, is that he didn't limit this to Western cultures. He lived with the Sioux, Lakota, for a long time and observed children's behavior. And they don't force it. They just back away, apparently, according to what Erikson saw there. Children learn naturally through imitation, he observed. So there's no direct didactic, hey, don't do this, do that. Just, okay, well, I have to do this, so I'm going to go do this. And then the child imitates the parents that way. He thought that children of the United States are much more restrictive, or their parents are much more restrictive and sanitized. So we do have this thing about dirt and other ugly things that we like to hide away and recoil from. So again, interesting expansion upon Freud's anal stage in particular. Erikson expanded the notion of the child's agency here, especially in regard to toilet training, to these strange things that are happening to the child that he or she won't understand, but needs to figure out for himself, but also needs help. This is also, like every stage, about the development of the ego, the sense of the self that emerges from resolving conflicts and dealing with crises. Right. All right, third stage. 4 to 5 years, psychosexual modes are genital and locomotor. Again, this is Freud, still following those stages, but expanding them, interpreting them broadly. There's Oedipal factors here in development, but at the same time, it's more broad and therefore perhaps more palatable and perhaps more correct. Erikson says that infantile sexuality here at 4 to 5 years, incest, taboo, castration complex, superego, all unite here to bring about that specifically human crisis which the child must turn from an exclusive pregenital attachment to his parents to the slow process of becoming a parent that is a carrier of tradition. All right, so there's some heavy stuff happening here at 4 to 5 years old, according to Erikson. So the parent then becomes a model, a role model, someone that the child can imitate in moving through these crises. And yet, from that same source, that sense of imitation or modeling, comes the Oedipal complex for Erikson and Freud, this sense of, and Erikson interpreted it to mean not that the male child wants to have sex with his mother, but there's a sense of competition. That's all he meant by it, Erikson, is that this sense of competition, like I was talking about. The child wants his own agency in relation to the parents. For Erikson, that's the Oedipal complex. That's the Oedipal stage. All right, so at this stage, children are extremely active, they're extremely mobile, they're talking, they're walking, they're experimenting, they're little scientists. Again, he taught in a Montessori school, so he got to see children in a unique environment, an unrestrictive environment. So the child's conscience develops here. And if the parents use that to shame the child, then that can be a crisis that must be resolved later, like in therapy. So what can happen, the strength that can come from this identity crisis is a sense of purpose or initiative, right, from 4 to 5 years. And then the core weakness is inhibition. So the child, if not parented accordingly, will feel guilt or at least inhibition, afraid to go out into the world, afraid to model the parent because the parent is too restrictive in the child's eyes. And so there can be this sense of, like I said, inhibition. I'm afraid to try this later on in life. Or just our favorite feeling of guilt, the one we know so well. Stage 4, 6 years to 11 years. This is the latent stage in Freudian psychosexual development. So sexuality gets sublimated into play and other activities for Freud. So now Erikson says 6 to 11 years old, the child is a maker. He learns to win recognition by producing things. He's much more ambulatory. He develops industry. He builds things. He makes things. He's a producer in the world. He uses tools to do it. The child enjoys the act of completion of an activity, says Erikson. Diligence becomes its own reward for the child. And so, therefore, the basic strength that emerges from stage 4 is competence. Yeah, I can move and live and breathe in the world, and things will be okay. I've kind of got the world figured out now, at least enough to get through it. And again, this represents a greater separation from the parents, of course, because as the child becomes more independent, he, by definition, becomes less dependent on the parents. So, if the child has unresolved conflicts in the past, of course, these can carry on into this stage, or if the crisis is not resolved well in this stage, then the child can become passive, inert, an enhanced sense of withdrawal from the previous stage. The child who's too afraid to do anything, and so when trying to do something, invariably fails. So this becomes a vicious cycle of self-recrimination. That's and the best part of that would just be inertia, just not doing anything. The worst part would be an enhanced sense of inferiority. But the strength that comes from this is a sense of industry our competence in the world. Oh, adolescence. A time of great change. Psychosexual mode, of course, is puberty. This is where the identity crisis phrase came from, is for adolescent identity crisis. Time of great change is puberty. Hormones, sexual organs becoming more active. New expectations, especially for social and academic adjustments. Middle school, high school, self-image typically suffers here. Life is increasingly stressful. I don't know about you, but I still think I'm getting over high school. It was horrific. And so a natural response would be to retreat back to the earlier stage, to just withdraw from all that and retreat and become that identity, that previous identity. But this is fatal, right? You can't go back to a previous identity. That is fatal, psychologically fatal. And so then that becomes problematic as you try to go back and become the person you were, just a happy-go-lucky child, right? I'm making things, look, I built this Lego thing, how cool is that? I did that, how awesome is that? Wait, what, puberty, what's that? Let me just keep building Legos, that'd be better. So this is also really the final stage, or at least the most important stage of separation from the parents. This is where your parents become incredibly stupid for reasons not known to you before. You're an adolescent, and they suddenly seem very stupid, and you don't know how they've brought you this far. Oedipal conflicts can return here, according to Freud. So the child must displace, sublimate those sexual feelings if they're there. And, of course, they do that through a ritual called dating. Adolescence is about finding out who you are. Just listen to all the songs. They must define and invent themselves here, but they don't know how to do that. It's a new thing. So they try on identities like clothes. And I don't know if you experienced this, but I did, and it was weird and fun. I'll tell you. Maybe you do too. These are unresolved crises that I wasn't able to deal with or wasn't willing to deal with at the time, and they stay with you and they affect your identity, because to resolve them is to secure your identity. Yeah. All right, so Erikson had these 4 ways of, I'm sorry, no, it's not 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways of dealing with, of coping mechanisms for adolescents. This is kind of interesting. So he said there's foreclosure. So some adolescents prematurely assume an identity of convenience, someone else's value system, such as one's parents, right? You know this person, right, in high school, who is just a mirror image of her parents, right? I mean, Tracy Flick in Election, maybe, I don't know. They don't think about it. It's, my father was a dentist, so I'm going to become a dentist. This is what I'm going to do, and their values are my values. That's an option. It's a way of perhaps not dealing with the crisis, but it is a coping mechanism. He says there's a moratorium, a timeout, where you just don't adopt any identity as you search for it. And this is usually a time of literal wandering to match the psychological, spiritual wandering. So like Erikson wandered all over Europe, lived as a bohemian. Maybe you've done that too. You know, you've just picked up and left and wandered around Europe, got a Eurail ticket, and just tried to find your way around. Diffusion. So this is where the adolescent just becomes apathetic, doesn't care about anything, right? I think we know such adolescents. I think I was one. It's a reaction to the identity crisis, right? I thought I knew who I was, now I don't. I'm too tired or too unmotivated to find out. Positive role identity or identity achievement. I know that I value justice, an adolescent might say. Therefore, I intend to study law or join the Peace Corps. So there's this kind of aggressive choice. That's not your parents' choice, right? So it's not that, but it's an aggressive choice. And you're just, okay, I see all these possible identities before me, and I see them modeled in my friends and peers, and I'm just going to choose this one. Okay, this is who I am. And I'm not saying that doesn't work. I think it works just fine for some people. So you just kind of forge ahead with the identity you've chosen. And then, of course, there's the negative role identity where you just deny the expectations of everyone and aggressively refuse an identity. All right, let's move on. Young adulthood. Psychosexual mode is genitality. So this is, college. Sharing, closeness, intimacy. If you haven't resolved your previous conflicts, or if you can't resolve this one, you end up isolated. For example, again, my story of going back to my high school friends, I asked about a guy I knew, and they said, oh, he doesn't come out of his house. And I said, well, would he join us for coffee or something? They're like, no, you don't understand. He doesn't come out of his house. I'm like, you're kidding, right? And they're like, no. And so, I get that. I get that feeling of being a young person in your 20s, and it's just too hard, and it's just too difficult. So you become isolated. Isolation becomes your friend, and it also, for Erikson, becomes a core pathology. Remember, we're just one stage removed from adolescence here, so a lot of that is still happening. Sexual intimacy is what dominates this stage, but that's, again, in Erikson's more broad-minded approach, that's really about love. It's about sharing. It's about the sense of participating in the world with someone else, or many people, for that matter. It's college. Stage 7. Not genitality, but generativity. This is middle age. The psychosexual mode here is procreativity. And again, in Erikson's terms, in Freud's terms, this is about penises and vaginas, and just those two for Freud. But for Erikson, it's a more cultural interpretation. It's a broader, even mythological interpretation. So it's about procreativity. It's about putting things out into the world. It might be sharing your wisdom, for example. It might be, teaching a course. It might be offering to be a mentor for somebody. It might be professionally related or not. It might be just a period of reflection that you may gain wisdom from and give it out later. It's just a really interesting time. It's about procreativity, and so the strength there is care of yourself and other people, right? So this is a really nice stage if you can come out with the strength from this identity crisis. And of course, I hope you can see how parallel these strengths and weaknesses are. So if you can't deal with this crisis where you're no longer the star quarterback, or you're no longer the great lover of many people, you're now kind of settled down into whatever. And if you can't adjust to that, then it becomes self-absorption. And so all you can think about is yourself. And so the strength is really going outward into the world. And so the weakness is turning inward into yourself. So it's also about, frankly, marriage for Erikson. It's not about many partners. It's about one partner and building a life. And of course, it's procreativity, so it's also about children at this stage and rearing children. And And, you know, to Freud's credit, he did say at one point that everything was about love and work. And that's what this stage is about, love and work. It's a caring for the future. It's a sense of handing on to the next generation. We saw some of this in the medicine wheel. Remember, it's where the people at this stage really are the best mentors for adolescents because they're kind of, you know, on the opposite sides of the medicine wheel. All right. Oh, right. He mentions philanthropy as a quality here, giving, literally giving money to others. All right. Stage 8, late adulthood. Psychosexual mode generalized. Okay, so we're not going to talk about it too much, I guess. The strength here is wisdom, right? Nice. The weakness is despair. So yeah, this is about, you know, if you haven't figured it out by this point, by late adulthood, by middle age, then you have a problem, frankly. I mean, I don't mean to be judgmental. I just am talking in terms of human development. Joseph Campbell says this, says you shouldn't be out questing at 60 or 70 or 80. You know, that's not the time for going on quests. That's the time for sharing the wisdom, sharing the elixir you've already found. Of course, I'm not a good example here. I feel like I was just questing a few years ago and acting out stage 4, maybe. I don't know. So that's what makes us suspicious, or makes me suspicious of stages, because, and what I liked about Kierkegaard is he said his 3 stages were always happening at the same time. That's how I feel, is that all these stages are kind of happening at the same time for me, at least a few of them. So wisdom or despair. Now, Joan Erikson, again, the woman of many names, was Erik's partner. They worked as a team. She did a lot of the writing, editing, and research, and she wrote a book called, they wrote a book called, well, I think she actually finished it, yeah, The Life Cycle Completed. It's the final revision of the earlier book. And this is Joan's voice. Erik's voice is there too. So she kind of brings this to completion for him, which I think is really beautiful and interesting. This is called The Life Cycle Completed. And she said, you know what we forgot, Erik? We forgot the 80s and 90s, very old age. And she saw, because they had never gotten there, right? And now she's here and she's like, this is a different stage. And I think she's probably right. If you've known people in the 80s, their 80s and 90s, I think there's a definite difference about their orientation to the world. So yeah, Joan formulates the 9th stage. It's when physical health begins to deteriorate. You've lost many close friends and family members, when death becomes a closer reality. So there's a closer connection between culture and identity here, because now you're thinking about your legacy, and your legacy will be in culture. It won't be anywhere else, right? And so it'll be in the works you've done, the children you've produced, what they produce, etc. She says, Joan Erikson says, lacking a culturally viable ideal of old age, our civilization, by which she means Western culture, does not really harbor a concept of the whole life. And I think that's pretty easy to see if we look around at how we treat the aged, especially in our country and culture. And I think you probably know this is not typical. In fact, it's fairly unusual. Most aged people are treated with great respect and wisdom. She says, aged individuals are often ostracized, neglected, overlooked. Elders are seen no longer as bearers of wisdom, but as embodiments of shame. And she says, quote, something is terribly wrong. Why has it become necessary to send our elders out of this world into some facility to live out their lives in physical care and comfort? Old people, she maintained, can and do maintain a grand generative function as in grandparenting. So that's the model that she proposed, is that like a grandparent, you can offer wisdom that is kind of low stakes because you're a grandparent. You're not immediately involved in the situation, which presents some barriers because you might not know as much, but it also presents some advantages in that you're looking from your perspective, which, while not being involved in the situation day to day, does involve the whole life lived and reflected upon, ideally. She calls this concept gerotranscendence, as in gerontology, right? Gerotranscendence. And says there's these changes in perception involved. A feeling of cosmic communion with the universe. All right, well, that would make sense, right? Time being shortened, which it literally is, but also psychologically is. Reduced mobility, implying a narrowing of your personal space. I never really thought about that, but if you've been around old people, their spaces are so small because simple ambulation, they can't move very far. And, think about that. What if your space, your sphere of action, day to day was a room or two rooms, In fact, for younger people, when they have accidents or hospitalized or whatever, that's one of the things they typically remark upon. Is like, I couldn't go anywhere, I couldn't do anything. Well, that's and a more wise and reflective sense of death. My father worked in his second job after he retired. He worked 27 years at a funeral home, and so he studied death. I used to call him the true philosopher because Socrates says the true philosopher studies death. So he saw it. He wasn't afraid of it, saw it all the time. All right, so Erik Erikson, Erik Homburger. Expansion of Freud, I think, in very positive ways. The development of the ego moves to the center of how we become who we are. Identity crises as the lens through which we determine our development or not. The psychosocial dimension, where culture, family, school, work become part of our development. He had a beautiful literary style. Of course, he was masculine, and so his perspective was masculine. And again, I keep referring you to the next to last lecture where we'll be talking about Carol Gilligan, whose book In a Different Voice takes on both Kohlberg, her mentor, and Erikson in terms of, she says, I don't think this is the same for little girls or women. So that's going to be an interesting corrective dialogue with these men. Also, I think Erikson's one of the last of the grand theories in psychology. Psychology, I think, as you probably have seen it or experienced it, or if you've studied the academic discipline, it's about data. Like everything else now, it's about qualitative data or quantitative data if you can get it in there. Or it's about pretty narrow focused, and I don't mean narrow in a bad sense, I just mean pretty localized sense of the talking cure. Without trying to connect your talking, with your treatment with these larger mythological themes. I was in therapy a few years ago, and I'm like, oh, you mean like Icarus? And she's like, who's that? And I'm like, okay, fair enough. This is not where we are now, and that's fine. People don't like his style sometimes because of that shift. Because remember how we talked about Freud and how Freud was, I think Freud's genius and his influence is because he told a great story. Even though he saw himself as a scientist and a reductionist, he still told a great story. Jung understood that clearly and told even better stories. But again, if you read critiques of Erikson now, if you read critiques of Jung now from academic psychologists, they're going to say, where's the data? All right, well, no, there's not going to be any data. There's going to be stories, there's going to be images. Remember, he was an artist and he taught art to kids. So that's where he's coming from, and so people get frustrated with that. For me, that's an attractive feature, because ultimately, for me, I think it's about a good story. So, plus, look at that. I mean, just look at that, basic virtues. How cool is it, right or wrong, if the data supports it or doesn't, how cool is it to think that we move from hope to wisdom? You know? That's a good story. I like that story. I wouldn't mind living that story, especially if I go through will, purpose, competency, fidelity, love, and care along the way. Stages along life's way, right? Erik Erikson, thank you for your attention.